The Victorian era, known for its industrial advances and moral rigidity, was also a time when punishment systems grew increasingly harsh and public. The penal system in Britain and its colonies during the 19th century reflected the era's belief in moral reform, which often translated into brutal punishments for those who were seen as threats to social order. Rather than focusing on rehabilitation, the Victorians saw prisons as a tool for moral purification. The notorious Bentham's Panopticon, designed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham, became an influential model for prison architecture. This circular design allowed guards to observe every inmate without being seen, creating a sense of constant surveillance that instilled fear and conformity in the prisoners. Punishments for less severe offenses were often designed to be physically punishing and socially humiliating. Prisoners were forced to work long hours in harsh conditions, typically in factories or on chain gangs. This was not only about punishment but also about using prisoners as a labor force. The Victorians believed that hard labor was a way to reform criminals by giving them a sense of duty and work ethic. The moral reform movement, along with a growing awareness of human rights, pushed for a shift toward more humane forms of punishment. The idea of reformation rather than punishment became the dominant ideology of the late Victorian period. This act marked the beginning of systematic prison reforms aimed at improving the living conditions of prisoners. Before this time, prisons were overcrowded, unsanitary, and often the site of brutal conditions. These institutions were designed to reform children who had committed crimes or were seen as morally corrupt. The Penitentiary Act of 1779, though predating the Victorian era, had a lasting influence on prison reform. This act called for the construction of separate cells for prisoners to encourage reflection and penitence. The idea was to isolate prisoners from one another to prevent the spread of bad influences and allow them to focus on their moral reform. The Victorians began to realize that violence begets violence, and punishment through pain and suffering was not an effective means of promoting social order. The emphasis on discipline, obedience, and moral rectitude often led to punitive measures that were more about control than about truly reforming individuals. Despite these dark chapters in history, the Victorian era laid the groundwork for the modern criminal justice system, where the pendulum has swung towards rehabilitation and human rights, even though many of the issues of power control and punishment remain. Instead, the focus gradually shifted towards rehabilitation, education, and the moral correction of offenders. However, this approach had its own challenges, including the psychological toll it took on prisoners subjected to solitary confinement. The children were subjected to strict discipline, forced labor, and harsh routines, all under the guise of moral education. The focus shifted toward reforming the criminal justice system and finding alternatives to brutal physical punishments. This was a progressive change in the penal system, which had previously been focused on punishment rather than understanding the circumstances of youthful offenders. The establishment of juvenile courts and reformatories reflected a growing belief in the possibility of rehabilitation for young people. Although the conditions in these institutions were still often harsh, rehabilitation became the primary goal, and the use of torture and public humiliation was largely phased out. However, despite these reforms, the Victorian justice system remained authoritarian and punitive in many respects, with prisoners still subjected to long sentences of hard labor and isolation. While the intent behind reform schools was to instill discipline and work ethic, the reality was that many children were subjected to harsh punishments and abusive conditions. The Victorian era's belief in moral correction for children often translated into punitive measures rather than actual rehabilitation. The Penal Reform Act sought to address these issues by implementing more structured systems of imprisonment that included education, work, and basic hygiene for prisoners. However, while the conditions in prisons improved somewhat, Many were still subjected to harsh labor and degrading treatment. This shift was not only a reflection of the era's changing moral values, but also a response to increasing concerns about the effectiveness of public punishments in preventing crime. But the reality was that many prisoners were exploited for their labor and treated as little more than property. The last public execution in England took place in 1868, after which executions were moved behind closed doors. The change was part of a broader effort to make punishment more private and humane, away from the spectacle that had once captivated the public. This practice, which involved sending criminals to penal colonies in places like Australia, was used to relieve the overcrowding in British prisons. Convicts were shipped off to the colonies, where they were forced to work under brutal conditions on farms or in labor camps. While transportation was intended to give convicts a second chance, it was often a form of exile. And forced labor, stripping prisoners of their freedom and subjecting them to grueling conditions far from home. The brutality of the transportation system, while less physically punishing than public executions, was nonetheless deeply dehumanizing. Public executions had been a tool for deterring crime, but they also became increasingly controversial as reformers argued that they only served to degrade and humiliate the condemned. The shift to private executions, including hanging in private chambers, was seen as a step toward moral progress. One of the most infamous punishments for women during this era was the ducking stool. Women accused of witchcraft, gossiping, or being a public nuisance were tied to a chair, which was then submerged in water. The act was intended to drown out their sinful behavior and was seen as both a physical punishment and a public spectacle. This was a key element in Victorian penal philosophy, as it emphasized obedience and control over any form of actual rehabilitation. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of discipline, order, and punishment, often using cruel methods to reform society's most vulnerable. The whipping was done in public, often in front of crowds, to further humiliate the offender. The idea was that public shaming would act as a deterrent, ensuring that the guilty parties would not repeat their offenses. The Victorians viewed the physical punishment of flogging as a necessary tool for maintaining social order, but the brutal nature of the act led to much debate, especially as the century progressed. One of the most notorious punishments during the Victorian era was the use of prisons as places of reformation. These institutions included reform schools for children, where young offenders were taught a strict moral code and forced into labor. These institutions were meant to reform children by teaching them obedience and self-control, but often subjected them to harsh and inhumane conditions. Although the era began to shift towards more private forms of punishment, executions were still held in public, often in crowded squares where the condemned would be hanged in front of large crowds. These executions were meant to serve as a warning to others, reinforcing the power of the state and the moral authority of the church. The act of public humiliation was seen as necessary to ensure the deterrence of crime, and the Victorians believed that witnessing an execution would prevent others from committing similar offenses. Victorian prisons were designed to isolate prisoners from one another, and the punishment was not just physical but also psychological. Inmates were often subjected to solitary confinement, which was seen as a way to reflect on their crimes and, in theory, reform their ways. However, the effects of isolation were devastating. Many prisoners suffered from mental breakdowns and psychological trauma. The idea of punishment through isolation reflected the Victorian belief that the mind needed to be as controlled as the body, and that reform could only come through total submission to authority. Public executions were another significant aspect of Victorian punishment. However, the Victorian fascination with justice did not stop at executions. For men, the Victorian system of punishment often involved hard labor. Another famous Victorian punishment was flogging, which was applied to both men and women. Although women were often punished for moral offenses like prostitution or adultery, The moral reform movement, a prominent part of Victorian social life, led to the establishment of many institutions designed to reform rather than punish. As the Victorian era progressed, the use of public executions and brutal punishments began to decline. One of the most significant changes in the penal system during the Victorian era was the move away from public executions. The Penal Reform Act of 1833 was another milestone in the evolution of the Victorian justice system. The introduction of convict transportation was another major aspect of the Victorian penal system. Reform schools were another key aspect of the penal system in the Victorian era, especially for young offenders. As the century progressed, the shift towards rehabilitation and moral correction continued to influence the development of the prison system. By the end of the Victorian era, public punishment was increasingly seen as a barbaric practice. In the late Victorian period, the juvenile justice system began to take shape, acknowledging that young offenders should be treated differently from adults. The abolition of corporal punishment in schools and the decline of flogging in prisons were also important steps toward a more humane approach to justice. As we look back at the Victorian penal system, it becomes clear that while it represented significant strides in reforming how society dealt with crime, it was also an era of great cruelty.